Yes, I had the slide prepared since I was going to do the quick introduction. But yes, for those, I realize a lot of you are going to have a conflicting workshop on Thursday and Friday, so you won't be able to come. But for those of you who can or are interested in even part, please do join. The format is going to be pre-circulated papers, so we do ask that you register, email the abteilungsbc@gmail.com for registration and to get links to the pre-circulated papers, including the paper that is the ostensible title of this, The Miraculous Realist Landscapes in Late Antique Syria. This is the title of my paper for that workshop, and today's talk draws from that paper, but it is not the same. So for those of you who are planning to go to the workshop and were looking forward to not having to read a whole paper because it would be read aloud to you, I'm sorry to disappoint. The talk is not the same as the paper, so you lose this hour, I suppose, of prep work. But I'm conscious with today's talk that there probably are multiple audiences in this room. There are medievalists and there are modernists. And if I gave a paper only for the medievalists, I suspect any of you who are not medievalists might not be terribly entertained, which is a cardinal sin of giving a presentation, to leave an audience bored. So hopefully there's a little bit for everyone, is the idea of the idea of how I assembled this today. So the rough outlines of how this is going to progress. I'm going to start by looking at what this is a reaction to. The idea of realism in hagiography is many ways a reaction to the dominant discourse in the field, which is that hagiography is a type of fiction, or can be best approached through the paradigm of fictionality, of a fact-fiction binary. So we'll take a brief look at this, at what the existing literature is, and then move into sort of the second introduction to the paper, which is looking at a specific miracle out of the life of Symeon Stylites by Theodoret of Cyrus. And we'll use this miracle, this chapter, as our hinge for the rest of the presentation, for what we will be thinking about, bring up some of the issues and concepts to cover. Then go into what is hagiography, as I think there's a good chance you have an idea of what you think it is, and I think you will find it is a much more complex idea than what you might think. Then into looking more at the lives of Symeon Stylites, multiple lives. The plural there is significant. And finally finished by bringing us back to realism, this idea of whether realism or fictionality is a useful paradigm for thinking about hagiography, and why we are having a conference on that subject. Again, in this room later this week. You should come. So, the idea of fictionality is in many ways the current dominant paradigm for reading and interpreting hagiography. There are not just two ways of conceiving of fictionality, but these two models are particularly worth addressing, as these are major, very simplified versions of kind of two common ways that you encounter in thinking about these texts. The first is a sort of brutal, ontological, blunt knife approach, shall we say, that anything which is not a fact is by definition a fiction. So because hagiography has fantastical elements in it, there are supernatural events, there are miracles, therefore these things are prima facie not facts, therefore they are fiction. So this is actually an attitude that you encounter quite frequently in the introductions to hagiographical texts that will talk about pulling out the pieces of factual evidence from the proverbial chaff of fiction within the text. A more nuanced approach, one of several more nuanced approaches that exists, I will admit, but one for us to consider, is the idea of an agreement model of fiction. This is a bit more literarily sophisticated approach. This is the idea that writers and readers, the authors and audiences, share an implicit understanding about the fictionality of the setting. Both parties, both the person producing the text and receiving the text, are in agreement with one another about the departures from reality, from the verifiable world. And this agreement produces an intentional and clear departure from reality, that where what is not real is understood as fictional, as an agreement between writer and audience. When it comes to dealing with hagiography, both of these approaches have problems. The ontological approach faces a problem when you start categorizing everything as fact or everything as fiction. You then run into the problem, is something which is not fictional by definition factual then? And are we living hundreds, if not thousands of years after the events we are reading about? Are we equipped to tell the difference, to distinguish this is fact, this is fiction? Are we good adjudicators of these questions? The other problem is that it destroys the unity of the text, the unity of authorship, the unity of culture, by saying we can pry apart individual pieces, we can take them out of context, hold them as a separate piece, devoid of context. It breaks it apart into pulls apart a mosaic into a bunch of individual pieces which we can each analyze individually and presumably come to a definitive answer. Is this a fact? Is this not a fact? The agreement model is, again, is slightly more sophisticated, has a slightly more sophisticated issues with it, and that is that hagiography, there is an agreement between author and audience. The agreement is, though, that this literature is truthful, not that it is fictitious, not that it is something separate from reality. It's that this literature reveals the truth about the world, reveals the truth, a spiritual truth, a higher truth about how the world works. Audiences do not interpret these accounts as fictions, as something separate from the world. These are part of the world. These are evidence for the world. So both of these models do have their uses and have been explored, but they run into limits. And part of my interest in having us look at realism as a paradigm for hagiography is that the realism can solve some of those problems. It creates its own problem. Sure, any framework does, but we'll move past a few, at least, as they currently exist. So, with that preface out of the way, I want to take a look at a specific miracle as the kind of cornerstone for what we'll be looking at for the rest of the talk, and that's a miracle of a distinguished Arab and a stone bird. This is from the life of Symeon Stylites by Theodoret of Syria, which is part of his group of collective lives of the saints of monks of the Syrian region. And chapter 18 says, in English translation, another miracle occurred, in no way inferior to the preceding. Among those who believed in the saving name of Christ the Master was a distinguished Ishmaelite, Arab, who had made a vow and promise to God with Symeon as witness. He promised to abstain until death from all animal food. Sometime, I do not know how, he broke this promise. Killing a bird, he dared to eat it. But since God wanted to lead him to repentance through a trial and to honor his servant, who had been a witness to the now broken promise, the bird's flesh was changed into stone, so that he could not eat it even if he wanted to. For how could he eat the body, which he had seized for food, if it had been turned into stone? Astonished at the extraordinary sight, the barbarian came with great haste to the holy man and made public his hidden sin. He told everyone his transgression, asking God forgiveness of his fault and calling on the saint for help to set him free by his all-powerful prayer from the bonds of sin. There were many eyewitnesses of this miracle who touched part of the bird near the breast, which was a combination of bone and stone. So, part of the reason I picked this text, and this passage, again, for those of you coming to the workshop, is not one of the passages I picked to pay attention to in the chapter I circulated there, which is part of the reason I wanted to come back to it, because I think it's an interesting passage that has its own group of dynamics that are kind of fun to think about and raise issues of what we're dealing with hagiography and thinking about this as realist literature. The first, in a lot of these come down to how evidence is handled in these texts. And these are evidence-based texts, which is perhaps a bold claim to make if you're not familiar with hagiography, but this is how they work. So in this case, we have evidence partly from the world of late antique Syria. So we have ethnographic details. We have detail that this distinguished individual was an Arab, Ishmaelite in the Greek terminology, who belongs to the Arab tribes who are neighbors to this region. And these are specifically barbarians, because they are not part of Roman civilization, which of course Symeon and the residents near him in northern Syria are Romans. The passage also establishes that this is verifiable evidence that exists outside this text, both by appealing to witnesses, an unnamed large group of witnesses that Theodoret insists experienced this, but also to what I think the implication is that there is an object that was kept in the at Symeon's shrine in Kalat Siman, which people could go and see, a physical object. And we actually come across this in several of other bits of the hagiography. Objects that are tangible objects that are referred to as confirmation of the stories that are told in the texts. As a quick aside for the rational explanation, I suspect it's something like this, a fossil bone sticking out of rock, so we can all feel clever and rational about it. I think it's probably something like this is what it's describing. Anyway, the rationality aside, we have signs of oral transmission of information. These are written texts, but these are written texts which engage very directly from oral tradition of the world in which they are set. So, again, this distinguished Arab makes a vow where Symeon is a witness. So we have, again, oral exchange of information and a witness who can presumably attest to the veracity of this information, as well as the process by which his sin was revealed. He made it public, and he told everyone about it. These are general appeals to wide, unspecified audiences, but it's worth noting elsewhere in Theodoret's account and in other hagiographies, the appeals to information are often don't have to be universal, not just everyone knows this. Theodoret, for example, says he personally experienced miracles that Symeon told him predicted the future to him, that he knew Symeon, he talked to Symeon, Symeon predicted the future. He attests this as personal witness to this. So we have oral tradition that appeals to sources within a living society in and around northern Syria. And the final little bit in this passage, and one which then I get to reveal what the sort of hidden reason why this passage is interesting for me, is the aside here, this I do not know, ukoida. This is a first-person narrative voice, which is used throughout this text. However, the context is that chapter 18 is missing in several manuscripts. Both the editor, the mid-20th century Cavenet, and the English translator Doran agree, because it's missing in multiple manuscripts, it's probably a later interpolation, since someone inserted this story into the rest of this text. A copyist, at some point in time, after Theodoret had written the text, somebody else put this in, but put this miracle inserted in seamlessly, inserted in using the same first-person voice. Nothing marks this as being an addition to the text. It's only analysis of many, many manuscripts that shows this probably wasn't part of the original composition. So, although this is a text with a named author, Theodoret of Cyrus, who is a bishop, a real-life person who is attested quite well outside of just this text, the transmission of this text is an open process. This is, you can think of this as like an encyclopedia entry in some ways, and that when it is transmitted, you can update it, you can provide it with new information, you can insert information into it, and it doesn't undermine the authority of the text. So scribes are readers. So scribes who copy these texts, and bear in mind, we live in, this is a world where texts are copied by hand as manuscripts. Each version of the text is physically written out by someone. We don't have mass printing as we are used to today. And each time it's copied out, scribes are readers. They're reading the text as they copy it, and they can be participants in this process. They can insert information, even when we have an author, normally for a text, a named author. And many hagiographies don't even have named authors, so the openness of those texts becomes even more interesting. So, with that passage in mind, I want to give a bit more of an overview of what hagiography is. Because, as it turns out, hagiography is first and foremost, there's a lot of it. So, to put in perspective, the Chronicle of Theophanes Confessor is one of the better attested pieces of late antique, early medieval secular, in inverted commas, literature. It's a chronicle, and it's it is our primary source for the history of the Roman political state in the 7th and 8th century. We are hugely dependent on this as a Greek source. And it's attested in 11 manuscripts, which is, by the standards of chronicles and histories, actually relatively well attested. Malalis, the Chronicle of Malalis, a 5th century or 6th century author who's also an important chronicler that we depend on, has one really problematic manuscript and fragments and translations. So Theophanes is positively well attested. But in contrast, Hippolyte Delahaye, one of the Bollandist scholars from the early 20th century, did an inventory of Greek manuscripts and counted over 2,200 of them. And that was in the early 20th century. That count is definitely out of date at this point in time. And within each of these manuscripts contain multiple lives or martyrdoms or multiple stories, multiple hagiographies in them. So each there's a lot of material from antiquity all the way through the modern period. This is a continuous, a living tradition of production of these, of composition of new ones over a very long period of time. I'll say, for reference, my main focus is on the first millennium. There are certainly people who are giving papers at Friday's workshop who do look at the 2nd millennium AD, and hagiography production is still a thing. It is still part of society, although dynamics change. And I'll, again, try to keep things quick and light and simplified as far as the introduction goes. Much of the modern study of hagiography builds on the works done by the Bollandist Society. This is founded by the Jesuit order, but is an independent society, became a much larger group of Catholic researchers, of philologists, of historians who came together over, centuries in order to pursue a project of establishing, the goal is to establish the historicity of saints, and by implication to try to identify which saints are fake, which ones are entirely made up, which they have done, and it's a huge amount of work that they have put into it over a very long period of time. The two main publications that are worth highlighting are the Acta Sanctorum, which is published in 68 volumes over the course of 3 centuries, which is organized following the ecclesiastic calendar. So we start in January, so that's what the title page of the January volume from the 17th century is there in its 17th century glory. And it follows the liturgical calendar. So saints are venerated on their saint day, which usually is the day of their death. So it's organized by when they died, not by when they lived, so not by chronological order. The other reference, the other reference material that, in a lot of ways, historians draw on far more frequently and more heavily are the Bibliotheca Hagiographica Graecae, Latinae, and Orientalis, the BHG, the BHL, and the BHO, for shorthand. These are alphabetical catalogues of saints and the separate stories about each saint, which makes it a little easier to look them up because all of the marks are together, for example, instead of being in, some in October, some in March, some in December. They're all together. You can find them a bit more easily. The BHO the first edition is in the late 19th century, and it has been the Greek and Latin BHL and the BHG have been updated in the 3rd quarter of the 20th century. The Bibliotheca Hagiographica Orientalis, the BHO, is a bit more out of date, unfortunately, but still useful as a reference material, a starting point for reference material for these things. A couple side notes just for sort of completion. The Bollandists also publish the Analecta Bollandiana, which is currently published by Breppels. That is a scholarly journal on the study of hagiography, which has been published since 1882. And they also published the Subsidia Hagiographica, which is a series of text editions of hagiographies, which has been published since 1886. So a long history of scholarship, not university scholarship, but a different tradition of scholarly, a different tradition of a scholarly community, in some ways sitting outside the sort of norms of historiography, which leads to some peculiarities. The first is the word hagiography itself. This is a technical term which was invented to describe the Bollandist project. The first use of this word in English is in 1821. It's only been a word in English for 200 years. So even though we're describing millennia of literature using this word, it's not the word that the people writing this literature used to describe it, to categorize it. It's a modern term looking back, setting this aside. The hagiography, it's obviously based on Greek. Hagios is holy, sacred, and graphein is to write, to scratch, literally. It is not a term in medieval Greek. Hagiography is not, doesn't show up in medieval Greek texts. It does appear in modern Greek, but in modern Greek it has a different meaning. Hagiographia refers to icon painting. So I have there we go, this side. It's mirrored, and anyway. This side we have a 16th century Russian icon depicting the painting of an icon. So sort of art depicting the production of the same art, which, I mean, that's always fun. The modern Greek word that corresponds to the Western notion of hagiography is hagiologia, hagiology, which is a word that sometimes the Latinate equivalent of that appears from time to time in literature as well. But one of the key features of this literature is that it is persuasive literature. And as a quick note here on the words that I and others use about this, I use the term cult to describe saints, the cult of saints. At least for a native English speaker, cult has a pejorative implication in how it circulates in colloquial English. So it's worth saying cult in this case is not a pejorative term. This is a descriptive term. It is a devotional movement that exists within a religion. Christianity is a religion, so devotion to saints is a movement within that religion. It is possible for a person to be a Christian and not to belong to, not to believe in saints, in miracles. It is also possible for a person to believe in the possibility of saints and the possibility of miracles, but not believe in specific claims about sanctity in miracles. People are not blindly credulous. They don't just believe the first thing that comes along. People throughout all ages exercise skepticism, and the point of hagiography is to persuade an audience, presumably an audience who belong to the second subcategory, who believe that it is possible for saints to exist, it is possible for miracles to happen, but don't yet believe that this specific person that this text is making claims about is a saint. That's the job of the text, to then convince a potential audience that this person was a saint and should be venerated as such. It is possible for these texts then to fail in this persuasive mission as well. Just keep that in mind. We don't have to assume that ancient and medieval audiences are incapable of exercising skepticism. There, in fact, a lot of evidence that they could and did and would exercise skepticism about claims, especially claims to miraculous things. And here the choice of image is of Zosimus and Mary of Egypt. Zosimus is the second-hand storyteller who is supposed to have met Mary of Egypt. Mary of Egypt is one of the most popular medieval saints. There's tons of art of Mary of Egypt from France and Germany all the way across the Mediterranean to Egypt, to Syria, into the Church of the East. Hugely popular saint. Very questionably whether she's her historicity is questionable at best. Put a strong doubt on that one. But hugely popular saint is a sort of example of the type of saint that the Bollandists were looking, were trying to look at. So one way we can think about hagiography is in terms of content. And simplified, there are kind of three major categories: the martyrdom, the life, and everything else. Martyrdoms are the most the most popular, the most prestigious form of hagiographical texts. This comes in part from one of these internal contradictions within Christianity, I suppose, and that it is wrong to try to get yourself killed, but there is nothing more noble than meeting your death for your faith. So don't try to get killed, but if you do get killed, that's the best way to go. There's a few sort of internal contradictions like that within hagiography when we think about it that make it interesting as a body of literature. So martyrdoms are about the spiritual struggle, person's, and about the end of a person's life. It's a violent death because of their faith, usually persecuted by some civil authority who is not Christian, be they pagan or not Manichaean. What's the Zoroastrian? There we go. Persecution in Persia or persecution in the Caliphate by Muslims. We like all of the above make for plenty of martyrdom stories. Martyrdoms tend to just be stories about the end of their hero's life. Doesn't tend to have very much biographical information, maybe a little bit on who they are, but the narrative focus is all on death and on the martyrdom. These are, so for example, in the collection, the Metaphrastic collection, which is a collection of saints' lives that are rewritten in the 10th century, martyrdoms are about half of the total content. So, as a sort of rule of thumb, about half the things people are interested in reading is about people dying for in service of their belief. So both the life and everything else are less popular as literature goes. Lives are, a type of biography, writing about a life. These are exemplary lives lived in the service of Christian faith, usually people who didn't successfully get martyred, so they are confessors, which is usually seen as less prestigious than a martyr, but still what many a pious Christian had to settle for. Lives are arranged chronologically from birth to death, but it is usually structured as a series of short stories. Unlike sort of modern biography, where there's an attempt to tell all sorts of information about people at various ages, like entire decades of saints' lives, of a saint's existence can be summarized in a single short vignette before we move on. And then other narratives, to quickly go through, there's translations of relics when they get moved from one spot to the other, and the miracles associated with relics. Posthumous miracle stories, saints, cult sites produce miracles, miraculous events over time. Sayings, the apopthegmata patrum is the kind of the collection of sayings par excellence from late antique Egypt, which are a type of part of this tradition of hagiography and orality. spiritually beneficial tales, collective biographies, and biographies of biblical figures as a sort of footnote of filling in the historicity of the Bible. So all of those content, though, aren't genres. Those content can all be expressed through any of multiple literary genres, this is where hagiography gets to be really, really, really messy, I think, because it is not a genre. It is a subject of literature. It's like saying all love stories. I mean, that covers a huge variety of types of narratives, of types of literature. Hagiography is about the subject of a holy person. And this can be told through, told in a lot of different ways. So Christian hagiographies evolved out of a common Hellenistic cultural background that Christianity shared with several other religious traditions in the late antique Mediterranean world. There are hagiographies for Jews, for Manichaeans, for pagans. There's a collection of hagiographies for Neoplatonic philosophers even. And in some ways, the New Testament itself, the Gospels in the New Testament, are basically hagiographies. They get classified separately as they get classified as scripture for cultural reasons. But from a literary perspective, the structure of the narratives, the style in which they're working, effectively can be classified within the same group of literature. And the narratives themselves show strong affinity with other literature floating around in the ancient world, with novels, which likewise the ancient novel emerged out of the same cultural milieu of Hellenistic Eastern Mediterranean and early Roman Eastern Mediterranean. They have affinity with it, not because they copied one another, but because these are the types of stories that people in this culture found satisfied. These evolved alongside one another, at least the earliest phases of this literature did. A sort of quick division of types of literature. Narratives can be structured in many different ways. They can be structured as epistles, or they can be embedded within other literature. There's also a phenomenon I can briefly gesture at. In later centuries, there's a preference for higher literary registers, more complexity, more formality in the writing. So many older texts get rewritten in fancier ways. So these are metaphrases. It's not a paraphrase. A paraphrase cuts things down. A metaphrase just changes how it is written. Although an epitome is a summary. So narratives can be done this way, but there's also non-narrative hagiographies. And these non-narrative forms, especially the encomia, are dependent on an audience understanding the narrative structure of the text. That they're a narrative structure that isn't covered in the non-narrative text. This is just sort of left implicit for the audience to presumably know the story of, for example, Mary of Egypt. You don't have to retell it in an encomia. You can just reference it, and the audience knows, and the speaker knows. It's so lots of different ways that this can be done, and it's also worth a final note on all of this complexity, is that this is a literature that is not just limited to Greek or Greek and Latin. This is a literature that is interactive between Greek and Syriac, Coptic, Armenian, Georgian, Arabic. All of these Near Eastern Christian communities translated material back and forth between each other, communicated. It's a interactive transmission back and forth. All of which paints, hopefully, a quick overview of the very complex way that this works. So, back to Symeon Stylites, and a bit more context for what we're thinking about with him specifically. First, the obligatory map. Everyone likes maps, right? We're dealing with the Eastern Mediterranean, within the Praetorian Prefecture of the East, the overall command of the organization of the eastern part of the Roman Empire. We have the Diocese of Oriens, both of which are administered from Antioch. Antioch, standing up and pointing to it. Actually, can I get there we go. Antioch. So we have reference to where that is. Symeon lived in and around, didn't spend much time in Antioch, but he lived just outside of Antioch, in the hills nearby. And the other location relatively near Antioch as far as this map goes is Cyrrhus, which is where Theodoric was bishop of. So this is the area. This is to place modern borders on it, this is where Turkey and Syria meet. It's a borderland, and unfortunately, the staging ground for a lot of the ongoing civil war that has been going there. So a lot of these the locations that we reference have unfortunately suffered a lot in the last decade. So asceticism, as a real quick background, Christian asceticism begins in Egypt. The first, the exemplary saint par excellence is Antony, whose life is written by Athanasius, the Bishop of Alexandria. Anthony founds the eponymous monastery in the eastern desert around AD 300, which makes it, and from here, monasticism and asceticism spread into Palestine, into Syria, and of course into the Western Mediterranean as well. So this is a phenomenon which we have some evidence, maybe the earliest origins of it at the turn of the 4th century, but it becomes fairly well attested and fairly widespread rapidly over the course of the 4th century. And there's several different types of ascetics. The kind of two major categories to think about are hermits, who nominally live alone, and Cenobites, who live together in communities as monks, as I think a lot of us think about them in the West. So Symeon Stylites himself, born roundabouts 390, dies in 459 AD. Again, lives near Antioch. And this puts him in about the 2nd or 3rd generation of ascetics living in Syria. It's relatively, place him in time. He's not the first ascetic in this region. He is the first ascetic to practice the living on top of pillars, though. This is a new thing in his that he invents. Because in his early life he belongs to monasteries, and all of the lives agree, and coming from separate separate sources, but they'll agree that he was disruptive to the monastery he originally belonged to, and effectively got kicked out. So he got kicked out on his own and had to come up with his own way of being an ascetic, effectively. So this is a 6th century votive plaque, now in the Louvre, but which was found in the church treasury in Merat el Noman, which is in northern Syria. And there's a Greek dedication you can probably kind of see the letters along the bottom of it that translates to, it's a votive. It says, "With thanks to God and Saint Symeon, I offer this." And it's worth noting, again, I don't talk about the dragons and snakes much tonight, but the paper that we'll be looking at together on Thursday highlights a couple of the passages in the various hagiographies that do link Symeon to snakes and dragons. So if you want snakes and dragons, again, Thursday, it'll be great. Symeon, we don't just know about him from art and from literature. The site of his pillar became a major pilgrimage site called Khelat Siman in Arabic, the fortress of Symeon. It is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It is part of the villages of northern Syria. This was an active pilgrimage site from Symeon's death until the Crusader period. It then obviously has fallen into disuse. This picture dates to about, I think was taken in 2010, which is immediately before the Civil War started. Unfortunately, the place of this sanctuary on a hilltop location has made it tactically valuable in many conflicts throughout history, including the current one. Satellite images seem to show that the site is largely intact, but there has definitely been fighting around it, unfortunately. And it's probably going to be a few years before we can safely go and check it out again, just for referencing. But it is there, the place where Symeon lived. And at the center of it is the ruins of his column, where the four basilicae meet in cross-section. So you can see the base of the last column he climbed up. And this model of asceticism, these Stylites, Symeon Stylites the Elder is the first who did this, but he struck a chord, shall we say. We have, and actually, I mislabeled this slide, is not clockwise. It's top row, then bottom row. So the top row is Luke the Stylite, Alypius the Stylite, and then the bottom row is Daniel the Stylite and Symeon Stylites. Oops, I'm doing it backwards. Symeon Stylites in the bottom right-hand corner. There we go. So it's not clockwise, it's like a back and forth. Anyway, sorry about that. That's a mislabel that I should have corrected before. But either way, all of these images are pictures from the Menologion of Basil II, which is a liturgical book full of a collection of saints' lives made at the turn of the 11th century, richly illustrated now in the Vatican Library, a great resource for anyone looking for pictures of saints and miracles. Highly recommended because the Vatican has digitized a lot of this stuff and made it available to look at. The practice, though, of stylitism, of sitting on top of saints, sitting on top of pillars, was found practiced by ascetics belonging to all major branches of Eastern Christianity, among Chalcedonians, Miaphysites, and Church of the East, Nestorians, which is a problematic term, but we'll gloss over that. This was practiced in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East until the 12th century, and there seem to be references to this continuing into the 15th century among Russian and Georgian ascetics. So this was a thing. People climbed up on top of pillars. For Symeon's life, though, there are three independent contemporary lives. The one by Theodoret, which is in Greek, that we've drawn passages from. Another one, and Theodoret's life was written while Symeon was still alive. Theodoret and Symeon died within only a couple of years of each other. But Theodoret also says he is still alive, he is doing this, and he doesn't cover Symeon's death. So one from Symeon's during his life, but it's a short hagiography, part of a collection of others. One that is a short posthumous one in Greek by one of his disciples named Antonius, who claims to have been present at Symeon's death. And then a long life. The Syriac life is like 4 times as long as the 2 Greek lives combined. Like it's a much, much longer text. The Syriac life, there's a colophon that describes this says this was written by 2 scribes, assembled by 2 scribes, I should say, Symeon bar Apollo and bar Khatar bar Adan, disciples of Symeon's cult site that are otherwise unknown. This is written about 15 years after Symeon's death, again dated by colophon inscription, and this is messy. It's chronologically disorganized. It gives events out of order. It's a kind of messy text, but it's interesting because it preserves it just quotes an entire letter from a priest, Cosmas of Panir, who's again, an otherwise unknown person, but just incorporates this entire text into it. Just, here's a piece of evidence, just quote it in its entirety. It's nowhere near as polished as Theodoret's life, or even Antonius's life, but it does make it interesting. Theodoret, of course, is a real person. A couple images of the abandoned city of Syris, which again is on the Turkish, it's on the Syrian side of the Turkish border, but again in northern Syria. And we know he's a historical person independently of these lives of Symeon Stylites. He wrote exegetical works. He wrote doctrinal treatises. He was involved in Christological controversies at the time. And epistles and historical works. So, back to the text to kind of wrap up. And to start with this, I want to go to the introduction, what Theodoret wrote at the start of his work. He says, "Now, although I have the whole world, so to speak, as witnesses to Symeon's indescribable struggles, I feared his story might seem to those who come after like a tale wholly devoid of truth. For what took place surpasses human nature, and people are accustomed to measure what is said by the yardstick of what is natural. If something were to be said which lies outside the limits of what is natural, the narrative is considered a lie by those uninitiated in divine things. However, the earth and sea are full of devout people who, educated in divine things and taught the gift of the all-holy Spirit, will not disbelieve what I'm about to write, but will surely believe." This is a rhetorical exercise in the introduction, but it does point to some of the issues that I've tried to raise here. This is a writer who is aware of the potential for audience skepticism, the potential that his claims can be rejected, that a person would reasonably say, if this is not part of the observable world, this can't be true, this can't happen. This is an awareness that miracles are outside of nature, which makes the claims of the text beyond the scope of human experience. And it tells the readers that this is truth, and asks them to believe that this is truth anyway. So when we return to the distinguished Arab and our miraculous chicken bone, what do we do with an interpolated miracle, of a miracle inserted by later scribes in Theodoret's voice into the rest of this text? It's then taken by later copyists, by later readers, to be part of the original text. It just made its way into a large branch of the manuscript tradition. I would say, contrary to what our instincts might be, this actually reinforces the authority of both Theodoret and of Saint Symeon. This shows that Theodoret is aware of more of Symeon's miracle working than perhaps he actually was. And it shows that, likewise, it bestows Theodoret's authority on Symeon's miracles, even the ones that he didn't tell us about. In this case, we have scribes/readers who are sharing in a narrative process, who are sharing in this production of reality here. So, again, wrapping up, when we're thinking about fiction as a framework, is where we started, where this project began from. Thinking about facts and fictions, I think part of this is a legacy of the Bollandist project. Not just the concept of hagiography, but this way of looking at these texts. Their goal was to establish the historicity of saints and to identify which ones were not historical figures. So I talked about Mary of Egypt as probably not a historical figure. Another example is Barlaam and Josaphat, which is a Christianized retelling of the Buddha story. Probably not a pair of Christian saints then, in the sort of rational as we would understand it. So Symeon's lives are full of factual details about late antique Syria, of grounding in that world. And many of these either were independently verifiable, and some still are independently verifiable from other sources. Hagiography is a subset of historiography for how we should think about this as a genre, and how it works as a, again, not genre, as a collection of literature. As these are truthful narratives about something which is supposed, well, it's truth. It's supposed to be something that happened. They have an edifying and persuasive purpose, which, of course, is what the purpose of ancient history is to edify, to improve the person reading it. And these are texts which integrate evidence into the composition. These can contain personal accounts, chains of oral authority, which can be compared with the Islamic tradition of isnads, which transmit the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad orally until they get written down. These include appeals to general knowledge. Everyone saw this. This was done publicly. Tangible objects, the example of the possibly fossil that we had. Geographical locations, specific places, specific references to things. And of course, direct quotations from documents, material that, integrating primary sources into your literature, if we should frame this as an undergraduate project, perhaps. So the inspiration for how I'm thinking about, how I started rethinking about this, comes from magic realism, which is a 20th century literary genre, which is a blend, which blends fantastical and supernatural elements into a realistic or mundane tone and setting. These are integrated together as part of this literature, which serves to reveal part of it is there to reveal the fantastical elements in the existing world. Perhaps one can think in this case akin to earthquakes and fossils as amazing things which exist in the natural world and might not have been explicable by ancients' understanding of how the world works. But it's also literature. I think the more interesting thing for us thinking about this as historians is that this is literature that bears truth. And this is often very political truth in the case of magic realism. A truth which is beyond the text, beyond a surface level reading of the text. And this higher level truth, I think, is part of the reason it can be useful to think about hagiography as a realist literature, because this is truthful literature, truthful, real literature set in the observable, verifiable world, but it contains supernatural elements. It contains miracles and magic. And this framework of realism emphasizes the unity of text. We can't pull it apart into facts and fictions. It's all realistic. We emphasize the unity of authors. Theodoret wrote hagiography, but he also wrote epistles, he wrote theology, he wrote a lot of other material. This doesn't set hagiography aside as something separate from the rest of his work, as something weird and fictional. It views it as part of a coherent work by authors, and it views it as part of a coherent work by a society. Because a lot of the features in these hagiographical texts, we come across them in chronicles, we come across them in letters, we come across them in inverted commas, secular literature of the time. We get these fantastical elements integrated into these texts. And instead of seeing them as interpolations of fiction into a factual text, we can look at them as a different type of realism, that is still coherent, that is still culturally coherent for the late antique and medieval Roman Orthodox world. And this seeks to engage the literature on its terms, on the terms that the authors and the audiences tell us that this literature worked, as a truthful narrative, rather than seeking to impose our own dichotomies on it as fact or fiction. So this doesn't solve all of the complexity. This doesn't make any of the complexity of hagiography go away. It's still a mess of genres. It's still a lot of very different styles of stories. In fact, I think one of the unresolved questions from working through this project is, I think, a real question of whether hagiography as a paradigm is useful outside of the Bollandist project. Like it describes their project, but is it useful for all, for scholars otherwise moving forward? So it describes the subject of literature, but there's a lot of literature covered by that one subject. So it's a separate question for a separate discussion, perhaps. But the idea of this is that it provides a framework through which we can systematically think about and categorize this literature as a totality, both relative to, both for its within itself, the text as a coherent whole rather than bits and pieces, and the text fit within the corpus of an author and the corpus of, and the overall society that it exists in. And as one final thought, I think it is interesting that we have a very participatory form of storytelling here that does not align with how we usually think about historical things. We think about authors and audiences as separate things. An author writes a piece, an audience receives a piece. And even as we've broken that down a bit, we're still influenced by publishers, by copyright, by editions that exist in our world. This is participatory art in a way that is really quite modern in some ways, which I think makes it, well, interesting, worth a re-examination by many a historian. So, further reading in case anyone wants some further reading. So, thank you for your time.